distress signal came from the edge of the Orion Cygnus arm, repeating itself on all emergency channels. The Galactic Concordance had seen this pattern before, a civilization vanishing overnight, their final transmission filled with garbled static. Except for the one phrase that never changed. Lingard, something worse. Captain Ilara Vasquez sat in the command chair of the Erebus, her fingers tightening around the armrests. She had read the reports. The Carenti Empire, a species older and more advanced than half the Concordance, had been wiped from existence within weeks. No war, no plague, no mass exodus, just silence. The same had happened to the Ohar, the Saldari, the Prexil Dominion. Each time the same final words, and each time their last known coordinates had pointed toward the same insignificant world. Earth. It wasn't just a myth, it wasn't a coincidence. "Bring up everything we have on the planet," she ordered. Dr. Rowe, her science officer, nodded and tapped his interface. His cybernetic eyes flickered as he accessed the Concordance archives, scanning through the records at inhuman speed. A few seconds later, his expression darkened. "There's not much," he admitted. Earth was classified as a pre-FTL civilization roughly 3,000 standard years ago. No confirmed interstellar travel, no known galactic alliances. It was quarantined under Concordance Directive 1. Ilara frowned. Directive 1. That's an extinction-class restriction, the kind used for bioplagues and rogue AI worlds. You're telling me a primitive species warranted that level of classification? Rowe hesitated. There's more. The records conflict. Some reports describe Earth as a barren rock, others as an industrialized world on the verge of post-scarcity. He swiped his fingers across the interface, frustrated. Entire sections of data have been purged or redacted. There are references to a vault, to something buried beneath the surface, but all details have been erased. Ilara exchanged glances with her XO, Commander Don, a hardened veteran with the instincts of a predator. He folded his arms. Someone wanted this place forgotten? Ilara exhaled. We're going down. The Erebus dropped out of FTL on the outskirts of the system. Sol burned bright against the void, a familiar yet alien sun. Earth itself appeared pristine, slush, vibrant, teeming with potential life. Yet the ship's scanners reported something impossible. No life signs, Rowe said, his voice thin with disbelief. No transmissions, no artificial power sources, no orbital defenses. It's as if every intelligent being just disappeared. The visual scan, Ilara ordered. The image of the planet magnified on the main screen. The oceans were impossibly blue, the continents untouched. Cities still stood, monolithic structures of glass and steel, preserved like artifacts. But there were no lights in the buildings, no vehicles in motion, no signs of decay. "This place isn't dead," Don muttered. "It's abandoned." Ilara straightened. "Take us down." The Erebus descended through the atmosphere, sweeping over empty highways and silent skyscrapers. The sensors picked up no biological traces larger than small animals. The streets were intact yet devoid of life. It wasn't like other ruined worlds where war or famine left corpses and debris. Earth was too clean. The landing thrusters engaged and the ship touched down in what had once been New York City. The landing ramp extended with a mechanical hiss, and the team stepped onto cracked pavement. The air was fresh, no radiation, no pollutants. The buildings, though overtaken by nature, stood without structural collapse. It was as if time itself had simply stopped. Rowe knelt beside a rusted-out vehicle, brushing his fingers over the frame. "This should be dust by now," he murmured. "The oxidation rate is wrong. It's like the laws of physics don't apply properly here." Ilara moved forward, scanning the walls of the nearest building. That was when she saw the first message. "Do not dig." The paint had long since faded, but the words remained, scratched into the steel surface of a skyscraper. Nearby, another message had been burned into the asphalt. with something searingly hot. "We were not—" Rose swallowed hard. "Captain, I think this planet is a tomb." They advanced cautiously. More warnings appeared the deeper they went, some scrawled on walls, others carved into stone, the same phrases repeated in dozens of languages, many of them long extinct. "Do not open the vault. We left to keep it locked." "If you can read this," Ilara's grip tightened on her weapon. "Vault." Rose's scanner beeped. "I'm picking up an anomaly beneath us, deep underground, artificial." Dahn's hand went to his sidearm. "I don't like this." Ilara exhaled. "We need to see it." They moved cautiously through the ruins, following the scanner's guidance. The streets narrowed, leading them to an open clearing where the ground had been disturbed. The earth had collapsed inward, revealing an enormous metal hatch. It was reinforced beyond anything they had ever seen. The markings on it were old but still legible. "This is not a door. This is a seal." Ilara's communicator crackled. The signal was pure static at first, but then, faintly, words formed within the distortion, a voice, ragged and broken, whispering through the centuries. They guard something worse. The ground trembled. A low, resonant sound echoed beneath their feet, like distant thunder rolling through stone. The hatch groaned, as if something beneath it had stirred. The readings on Rose's scanner spiked. "Captain," he gasped, "something's waking up." The team turned, sprinting for the Erebus, but before they could move, the sky darkened. The shadows lengthened, stretching unnaturally across the buildings. A whispering sound filled the air, growing into an overwhelming cacophony of voices, not human, not sane. Then, one by one, the messages changed. The scratched warnings, the desperate scrawls, the etched words on the city's walls. Each letter twisted, rearranged by an unseen force. They now read, "You should not have come." Then the screaming began. The moment the ground shook, Ilara knew they had made a mistake. It wasn't just a tremor, it was a response. The air around them thickened, the stillness of the dead city breaking apart with an unnatural hum. The light dimmed, not like a setting sun, but as if something vast and unseen had passed between the planet and the sky. Shadows stretched unnaturally long, coiling and twisting, moving without a source. Rose's scanner emitted a shrill, rapid beeping, his eyes wide. "Energy levels spiking beneath us. Impossible fluctuations, Captain. Something is—" The static in their comms cut through his words. It wasn't just interference. There was a pattern, a rhythm in the distortion, something trying to speak. The transmission they had intercepted from the lost Carenthi fleet had sounded exactly like this before. It collapsed into meaningless shrieks. And then the screaming began. At first, Ilara thought it was coming from the city itself, as though the walls and windows of the empty skyscrapers had learned to wail. But no, it was coming from the hatch. Metal shrieked against metal, vibrating, bending inward as if some immense pressure beneath it was forcing its way through. The screaming rose in pitch, something inside clawing against the walls of its prison. Dahn had his weapon drawn. "We need to go, now." Ilara's breath was steady, but her hands weren't. She had led missions into ancient war zones, derelict ships filled with the bones of the forgotten, planets swallowed by rogue AI. She had never felt like this before. This was different. This was wrong. And still, she couldn't move. Her eyes locked on the hatch as the letters carved into its surface, letters that had survived millennia, began to twist and change before her eyes. The old warnings melted into new ones. "It knows you're here." The voice came from behind her. She spun, weapon raised, but there was no one there, just the city, silent and empty. But the moment she turned away from the hatch, something in the corner of her vision shifted. A figure. It stood in the street, featureless, humanoid in shape, but wrong. A dark silhouette against the already dim light, as if it were not an absence of illumination, but a tear in the fabric of reality itself. No eyes, no mouth, no movement, yet she knew it was watching. "Captain!" Ro's voice was a thin whisper, and she realized he saw it too. And it was gone. Just gone. The scanner in Ro's hands flickered wildly, his cybernetic eyes unfocused, overwhelmed. Ilara grabbed him by the shoulders. "Ro, focus!" He gasped, shuddering. "It's not one thing." His voice was unsteady, as if something were pulling thoughts directly from his mind. "It's not a creature. It's not alive. It's—" The hatch groaned again, and the world tilted. Not physically, the ground remained still beneath their feet, but something shifted in the air, something vast and incomprehensible. The city around them no longer felt like a place, but a thing watching them, shifting at the edges of their perception. Dawn fired first. A single plasma shot, aimed at nothing, at the space where the shadow had been. The bolt hit the air and stopped, not against a barrier, not absorbed, just ceased to exist. The air rippled, folding over itself. And then the streets weren't empty anymore. Figures stood at the edges of the buildings, at the tops of rooftops, at the far ends of streets. Watching. They weren't human, they weren't anything, they were gaps, absences in space, shaped like people but devoid of existence. Ilara grabbed Dan's arm and yanked him back. "Run!" They turned and sprinted. The comms flared to life, not with voices but with whispers, layers of sound that shouldn't exist. "You should not have come." Ilara didn't look back. She could hear footsteps behind them, but not on pavement, on something softer, something wet. The street, solid moments ago, felt like it was shifting beneath their boots. She pushed harder, racing toward the ship, the Erebus now the only thing that still seemed real. They reached the clearing where they had landed, but the ship wasn't there. Ilara stopped so fast she nearly fell forward. No. The Erebus had not been destroyed. It had not left. It was simply not there, as if it had never existed in the first place. The landing site was intact, but there were no burn marks from the thrusters, no indentations from the landing gear. It was as if they had never landed at all. Ro made a choked sound. "This isn't real. This isn't—" The whispering grew louder. The sky cracked. Not the clouds. The sky itself. It splintered like glass, and beyond it, something moved. Don grabbed his head, his breath ragged. "What the hell is that? What?" He stopped, his eyes widened. Ilara turned and followed his gaze. The city was gone. The buildings, the streets, the skyscrapers, gone. In their place stood only an endless, empty landscape, stretching into the distance, where shadows moved without light. And then the realization hit her, colder than any void. This wasn't Earth. It had never been Earth. Ro's voice was barely a whisper. "It's not a planet." Don exhaled, shaking his head violently, as if trying to wake up. "It's a containment field. The whole world, the whole thing." He looked at Ilara. "Not to keep something out." Ilara completed the thought, the words tasting like ashes. "To keep something in." The whispers crescendoed, overlapping, forming new words, words that did not belong in any known language, yet carried meaning deeper than language itself. "That it knows you're here." The shadowed figures were closer now, the gaps in reality. They did not move like things constrained by time. They flickered, reappeared, ceased to exist in one place and formed in another. The air between them and the figures was thinning, as though whatever had been keeping them at bay was breaking. The sky cracked further, and then, for the first time, the figures spoke. Not a whisper, not a transmission, a voice, overlapping and infinite, one word spoken with all the weight of inevitability. "Leave." Ilara didn't hesitate. She grabbed Ro and Don, pulling them into motion. It didn't matter that the ship was gone. It didn't matter that the city no longer existed. They had to move. But the ground was no longer solid beneath their feet. It shifted, folding inward, drawing them toward the hatch that was no longer a hatch but a hole, a wound in reality itself. And from that wound, something was watching. Not the figures, not the shadow things, something below, something vast, something ancient. And it saw them. Ro screamed first. Elara turned just in time to see him fold, his body collapsing inward on itself, vanishing in a way that defied every law of physics. He didn't leave a corpse, he didn't disintegrate, he just ceased. Don grabbed her, his face pale with terror. "We have to—" The world lurched. The sky shattered completely, and for one brief moment, Elara saw what lay beyond it. And she understood. The civilizations that had vanished, the Corinthi, the Olmar, the Saldari, they had not been killed. They had seen, and seeing was enough. Her vision blurred. The whispers overtook everything. The last thing she heard before she was swallowed by the void was the final message, the one she had ignored for too long. "I may guard something worse." Then everything was gone. There was no light, no sound, no sensation, just emptiness. Elara was floating, but there was no gravity, no air, no direction. She didn't know if she was falling or rising, if she was even moving at all. She tried to breathe, but there was no breath, no lungs, no body. And yet she was aware. Memories flickered at the edges of her mind like dying stars. The Erebus, the mission, the ruined cities, the shadows that weren't shadows. Ro screaming, folding in on himself like he had never existed, the sky cracking apart like fragile glass. And something, something beneath. She should have been afraid, should have panicked, struggled, but there was nothing to fight, nothing to grasp onto, just the knowledge that she had made a mistake. Something else was here with her. It didn't speak, it didn't move, but she felt it, a presence pressing against the edges of her thoughts, ancient and patient, watching. The silence stretched into eternity, or maybe only seconds. Then the world came back. A sudden, violent impact, the feel of a body reasserting itself. Air in her lungs, gravity pulling her down, a blinding white sky above her, clouds stretching too far, too high, too empty. Her vision swam, her limbs sluggish. Elara gasped and rolled onto her side, coughing hard. The ground beneath her was cold and smooth, not dirt, not stone, but something in between. It felt wrong, not artificial, not natural, something else. She pushed herself upright, head pounding. Around her the landscape stretched featureless and endless, a pale, cracked surface vanishing into the horizon. No ruins, no cities, no. Da'an was beside her, his face pale, his breaths coming fast and shallow. His hand was pressed against his temple like he was trying to hold himself together. "Elara?" His voice was hoarse, uncertain. She swallowed hard. "Thank you." He nodded, barely reassured, his gaze flicking around. "Where?" His voice faltered. Because there was no where. This wasn't the city, wasn't the ruined world they had walked through. It was something else. A transition, a threshold. She knew it, deep in the part of her mind that still carried the knowledge of what she had glimpsed before the void swallowed her. This was the space between. Don exhaled sharply and touched his wrist, activating his comm. Static. He tried switching channels. More static. Elara did the same, even though she already knew the answer. No signal, no ship, no Ro. Her gut twisted, grief rising, but she pushed it down. There was no time for it. Ro was gone, folded into nothingness. She had no idea if he was dead, or if something worse had happened to him. Don turned, looking behind them, then cursed under his breath. Elara followed his gaze. The shadows were still here. Not many, only 3. Standing on the horizon, distant yet present, their featureless void-like shapes somehow darker than the air around them. They didn't move, but she knew they were watching. She clenched her jaw. "We have to move." Dawn looked at her, eyes wide, disbelieving. "Move where?" He gestured around. "There's nothing here." "There's something," she said, voice firm. "There's always something." She wasn't sure if she believed it, but standing still wasn't an option. She started walking, picking a direction at random, and Dawn followed. They moved in silence, boots crunching against the cracked ground. The sky never changed. No sun, no moon, just an endless blank expanse above them. Time stretched, meaningless. They walked for hours, or minutes, or days. The shadows didn't follow, but they never left. Then, finally, they saw it. The structure. It rose from the ground like an intrusion, black stone against the pale emptiness. Not a building, not a ruin, a monument. As they got closer, Ilara's breath caught. It was a door. Not a vault, not a hatch, not like the thing they had seen before. Just a simple, rectangular doorframe, standing alone, unconnected to anything. And yet, the moment she saw it, she knew. This was what the others had left behind. The lost civilizations, the vanished species, the ones who had disappeared after leaving the same message. They had come here, and they had gone through. Diane stopped beside her, staring. "You feel it too?" Ilara nodded. The door wasn't glowing, it wasn't humming with energy, it wasn't obviously anything. But it felt like the space around it wasn't quite real. She stepped closer. Dawn grabbed her wrist. "Ilara." She looked at him. He didn't say anything else. He didn't have to. They both knew. This wasn't just a door, it was a decision. To leave, to step forward, to find out what lay on the other side. Ilara's heart pounded. The last warning echoed in her mind. They guard something worse. And yet, she already knew what she was going to do. She took a deep breath, reached forward, and stepped through.